So you may remember from the verbal communication video that verbals are communication with words. Well, nonverbals are communication with no words, meaning everything but words, okay? Remember I said that? We're going to come back to that in a second. There are 4 different characteristics of nonverbal communication. There is the fact that nonverbals are inevitable. You may remember again from the verbal communication video that we talked about how dead people communicate, okay? They're inevitable. Whether you want to communicate or not, you are communicating something, even if it's just to communicate that you're not communicating, okay? Nonverbals are a primary conveyor of emotion, meaning if you ask me how I'm doing today and I just say I'm fine or I'm fine, then you may or may not believe me because my tone told you that I'm not so fine, okay? My posture told you that I'm not so fine. And my rate of speech told you that I'm not so fine, okay? The only verbal there was I'm fine. Now, we're more likely to believe that I'm not fine because of these 3 factors right here, particularly because nonverbals tend to be multi-channeled, okay? So they're coming from several different channels often. And because of that, it's almost like a 3 against 1, okay? Not that they always come in 3s, but it's like a 3 against 1 here. So they're multi-channeled, and we're more likely to believe them over the nonverbals if the verbals and nonverbals are not matching, are not parallel. And then nonverbals are ambiguous, meaning you can hear and or see a nonverbal and you can interpret it one way, but another person could interpret it another way, and yet still another person could interpret it another way. So they're very ambiguous, which is why it's very important to define those nonverbals using verbal communication as often as possible, okay? There are 5 different types of nonverbal communication. There's kinesics, there's haptics, vocalics, proxemics, and chronemics, okay? I'm going to go into that a little bit in depth. I'm going to go into each one a little bit in depth, but I wanted to make sure you understood one thing. If I wrote a text message to you that said, I am so happy to hear from you. Happy face. Okay? If I wrote a text message that said, I am so happy to hear from you. All of these are verbal communication. And this guy right here is nonverbal, even though you typed it. That's a common misconception. Just because you wrote it doesn't mean it's not nonverbal. You can make nonverbals through many different channels, including technology, okay? So I am so happy to hear from you, all verbal communication, but the emoticon, or emoji as most people call it, is a nonverbal form of communication. If you notice, so many times people will send emojis, especially with the plethora of emoji we have to choose from these days. Some people will send them, and we have no idea what they mean by that. Again, nonverbals are ambiguous, okay? So it's very important to remember that once there are words, it's verbal. Once it's not a word, it's nonverbal. We have glossed over the types of nonverbal communications, kinesics, haptics, vocalics, proxemics, and chronemics. We are going to break down 2 of them. The other 3 are more or less self-explanatory. We're going to start with kinesics. There are 3 different kinds of kinesic communications, okay? There are illustrators, emblems, and adapters. Illustrators are augmenters, okay? Meaning they need to augment a verbal communication. So, for example, you can't leave your arms by your side and say the man was this tall, or the insect was this big, or her hair was this long, right? You have to show. So the man was this tall, the insect was this big, her hair was this long, okay? So they're augmenters. They augment verbal communication. Emblems are pretty much the opposite of illustrators. Emblems can stand alone. So I can completely close my mouth and I can do this. Or I can do this and it means something different. Or I can do this. Or I can do this. Now, obviously, that last one in particular, all 3 of them are, but that last one in particular is very ambiguous. You have no idea what I did that for. But it is a nonverbal and it can be interpreted. So those are emblems. And then adapters are in response to a physical need. So if you are cold, you might do this. If you're tired, you might do this to yawn. If something is itching you, you might scratch it or something like that, right? There are things that you do in order to basically make your body more comfortable, okay? This is important to note, particularly when you are in an interview or you are in some kind of context where someone is purposefully kind of judging you. I mean, they're sitting and they're watching you and they're watching your movements and they're making very deliberate judgments. So for example, in an interview, you don't want to yawn. That's not a good idea because that can be interpreted in many different ways. Sure, you might just be tired, but it could be interpreted as you're bored. And you never want to be interpreted as someone who is bored in an interview. So all 3 of those are kinesic types of communication, okay? Proxemics, if you remember, is communicating through the use of space. Proxemics happen to be my favorite, okay? There are 4 different ranges of proxemic distances, okay? You have intimate space, which is up to 18 inches. You have personal space, which is 18 inches to 4 feet. And then you have social space, which is 4 feet to 12 feet. And then you have public, which is anything over 12. Of course, this is not, it's not necessarily exact, but these are the ranges, and they're a good thing to know in terms of communicating to others how you feel about them, okay? So for example, this isn't necessarily something that you talk about, but if you have a significant other and you are always distancing yourself physically from them, that communicates something to them, right? We don't know what that is, but you might be communicating something to them. Same goes for if you're in an office setting and you are constantly in someone's personal space, that communicates something to them. And it may be negative, it may be positive, it may be welcomed, it may be not. But these things are very, very, very important to be aware of. Some people are more aware of their personal space than others, okay? An interesting thing to think about is how we interpret our personal space without even really thinking about it. So you walk into a library, or you walk to a bus station, okay? Usually at a bus not a bus station, but a bus waiting area, bus stop. You sit at a bench, okay? And the benches are usually not that large. And there's one other person sitting on the bench. What do you usually do? You might sit on the other end of the bench, but more than likely you might stand. That's kind of custom in Western settings. You go into an elevator. There's one other person in the elevator. They're standing on the side where the buttons are. Very, very often, more often than not, that person will press the button for the floor that you'd like to go to instead of reaching over and going into their personal space. Of course, you may be comfortable enough to reach over into their personal space, but a lot of people aren't. I did an experiment when I was in grad school that I thought was a whole lot of fun. It was just a personal experiment because I don't have a whole lot of need for personal space. But I went into an elevator in the dorm where I was living, and there was one other girl in there, and she was standing on one side, and instead of going to the other side, I decided that I was just gonna shimmy on over to her side. So it's just me and her in the elevator, and she's on one side, and I decide to go right on that other side with her. She was so uncomfortable. She took out her cell phone. She literally was fake texting people. I mean, it's very interesting how that personal space varies from person to person. And personal space is also a very cultural thing. Some cultures don't need or aren't trained, I guess, from they're young to need as much personal space as other cultures. And then, like I said in previous videos, there are cultures within cultures, so there's subcultures. And in America, same thing goes. There are subcultures here where they kind of veer from that Western idea of needing their own large personal space.